All right, I think I'll get started. This is the Widgetizing WYSIWYG talk. And for those of you who just joined us here, here's the link to the slides. There'll be some code examples, so it might be helpful to take a look at the slides on your computer if you've got one here. My name is Brandon Neil. I'm Brandon Neil on Twitter and bneil on Drupal.org. I'm a web developer at the University of Iowa in the Central Web Services group. And we're going to be talking about building WYSIWYG, building widgets with CKEditor 4. And so there's a few assumptions I guess I want to talk about first before we get started. The first, I'm going to build a really small Drupal module. Is there anyone here that hasn't built a module before? It's okay. Raise your hand. Okay. So I'll go over it a little bit, but like I said, the examples are here, and there's a Git repository too of the code. So, and then most of the presentation examples are in JavaScript. So, and specifically, we'll be working with the CKEditor 4 API. There's some API methods that we'll be using. So, if that doesn't sound interesting to you, feel free to go. But it's all of it is documented as well, and I've given links throughout the presentation to the CKEditor documentation. So taking a step back, though, I just want to talk about structure for a minute. Drupal has a lot of structure built into it. Core, as well as the idea of turning on a module, a contrib module, and enabling a whole new set of functionality. I mean, we have content types in Drupal. We have fields on those content types or other entities. We have view modes for those entities, and then we have image styles for our image fields and that sort of thing. But there is one place, I think, that many of you in the room have probably seen where on some site build, structure can kind of go out of the window, just fly out of there. And I think it's this area right here. And so this is a body field. I've built many of those before. I assume many of you also have. But, content editors know these sometimes. They get frustrated with them sometimes. People sometimes think they're evil, but that's okay. Kind of just depends on the person. But my goal here is to show you a new feature in CKEditor 4 that may let you create a little bit more structure inside of your WYSIWYG if you decide to use CKEditor, and go from there. So let's talk about CKEditor 4 just a little bit. It's a rich text editor, or what you see is what you get. It's the default editor in Drupal 8. And there's actually 2 contrib modules for Drupal 7 and Drupal 6.2 that you can use to use CKEditor 4 on your sites. Show of hands, who knows that they're using CKEditor 4 on their projects? Okay. And so some benefits of CKEditor 4. It's also an open source project. It's accessible. It's highly accessible. They tout it as one of their big features. And it has 2 new features in some of the latest point releases. One is called the Advanced Content Filter. And I'll get to that, and I'm going to call it ACF going forward. But I'll get to that later in the presentation. And then that was introduced in CKEditor 4.1. But the real thing I'm going to talk about today is widgets. And so that was introduced in 4.3. So what's a widget? So widgets are, and I took this directly from the CKEditor documentation, which that is a link to the CKEditor project documentation. They're special rich content units And what they do, they allow groups of elements to be treated as like one entity is such a loaded term right now for this group, but as one instance of something inside of the rich text editor. And so we'll see a few examples of what it is in a bit. But basically what a widget allows is the structure of the widget is immutable. Once you place it, you can select it and move it around as a whole. But in doing so, the structure around the widget doesn't get edited. And so that allows a few different things. So that allows you to easily enforce consistent styling of the widget, because that wrapper or what have you doesn't break down while moving it around. But at the same time, you can actually edit individual pieces of it. So we're going to be building an example widget today in this, and we're going to be building what I'm calling a callout. And it's going to have a exterior, like a div, and then a nested div, and then an editable area inside of that div. And so you can still, you can have more complex widgets, and which can have multiple editing pieces. And inside of each of those editable areas, you can actually limit the available elements. And so, for instance, let's say I have a text area inside of my widget. Maybe I only want to allow, bold, italicized, links, and I don't want to, allow tables inside of that. That's the kind of thing that I can do. So here's 4 examples of widgets, and I'm going to only go through one of them. And we're going to go through the leaflet maps one. So this is on CKEditor.com, and it's part of their plugin repository. And I'm going to scroll down here to the demo, and hopefully this gives a little bit of a clearer picture of what we're going to be talking about today. So let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Yeah, okay. So in this example, who's familiar with leaflet? Okay, so some of these examples should be familiar here. But basically, each of these maps inside this WYSIWYG are considered a widget. And the way we know that this is a widget is when we hover over one, 2 things happen. We get this little, I'm going to call it a draggy. I don't know what the actual technical term is, but in the upper left-hand corner of each widget, we get the little dragging crosshairs. And then also when we hover over it, there is a like a yellow highlight around the whole thing. And so this is a pretty complex widget. It's got a map inside of it. We can drag this around, and the whole map itself moves. You can also double-click on the dragging, and you get a dialog. So this is, like I said, this is complex, and it's got multiple options here. We can change. I'm from Iowa City, Iowa, so I can change the map to point there. I can add a mini map, and there we go. So yeah, it's movable. It's non-destructive when that happens. Are there any questions about what a widget is? All right. So I'd encourage you to take a look at all of these examples, and there are more too on the CKEditor website. One of the most popular ones is probably the enhanced image one. That's the one that lets you do a caption for your images, which is pretty nice. So we're going to create a widget. Here's the link to the widget that we're building. And like I said, it's going to be a simple callout. I have a site built that has it already built. And so I've got some dummy text here. And the dummy text is about a pet business. And so what I want to do is take this list and do something like maybe float the list over in a little container, which I'm calling a callout, on the right-hand side, or move it around. So to do that, I'm putting my cursor in the WYSIWYG, and then The little icon I built for this is a little microphone piece. But when you click that, I get a dialog. I'm setting alignment. And I create this little callout. And I forgot the P. But so I can do a few things here. Like I said, I can move it around. If I double click on that, I get my dialog again. I'm going to change it to centering it, and then making it wider. I don't think that looks good, so I'm going to put it back. The other thing I want you to notice is when I don't know how easy it is to see on here, but when I click into the widget, certain buttons get disabled, and so that's the feature of only allowing certain elements to be in the widget. So I think that's really powerful. You can build these units that structurally you can define the markup, and then also editorially you can say what's in what. So if I look at the source of this, you can see this is the structure that we're going to build. We have two nested divs, a callout div, and then a callout content div. Are there any questions about that? Feel free to raise your hand throughout this if you've got anything. So, since we're building a widget inside of CKEditor inside of Drupal, we need to do a few things. We need to download the CKEditor 4 library, and also either the CKEditor or WYSIWYG modules for this example. This is all in Drupal 7, but the plugin, the WYSIWYG plugin that you're going to be building, you could use in Drupal 8. You just have to find the Drupal 8 way to include it into Drupal. So, downloading the library, there's actually a guide about the widget installation on CKEditor.com. The widget plugin itself from CKEditor is a new plugin, so that means that it's actually not included in any of the basic packages that CKEditor provides, which is a sad face. So you actually have to go through their builder or download it separately and include it in your project. So if you take a look at their example installation, they kind of talk about that here. Oh, that's really small. Where you have to include it into the build from CKEditor. So make sure that you have the widget plugin. Otherwise, none of this is going to work for you. And then I'm going to be using the WYSIWYG module. It's what I'm most familiar with from work. We haven't used the CKEditor module. And actually, you need the dev version. The last stable release of the WYSIWYG project I think is in 2012. So you need the dev version so it registers the CKEditor 4 project. So let's build it. First, we're going to start with the Drupal bits. And what I mean by that is we're going to be creating a module, the MidCamp_widgets module. And it's going to have initially two files. It's going to have a .info file and a .module file. And this is where we get into, we're building just a really small Drupal module. And in the info file, there's just a few fields here. We're identifying it's the name of the module, which is MidCamp Widgets, and its description, what version of Drupal, and it's 7, and then the only dependency of the project, which is the WYSIWYG module. So for the MidCamp widgets.module file, this is where you either need to use hook WYSIWYG plugin or hook CKEditor plugin. And like I said, I'm using the WYSIWYG module, so the one I've identified here is, the one I'm using is hook WYSIWYG plugin. And so I know that's probably, with the color, hard to read, but I will go through I'll verbalize what it says. And so with the WYSIWYG module, WYSIWYG lets you determine, you can choose from multiple WYSIWYG editors to load for your project. So this hook, you actually have to, I'm switching based on the editor parameter. And in the case that it's CKEditor, I want to, I'm returning an array of new plugins that I'm creating, and this hook only has one plugin. I'm calling it callout. That's right here. And then there are a few important parameters in this hook. There's a path option, which this is really the path to my new plugin, and it's going to be the path to my MidCamp widgets module /plugins/callout, and then the file name of my new plugin that we're going to be creating, which is plugin.js. We have to define a button, and so the button is that callout button that I showed you earlier. And then there's a few specific parameters here that we have to include. So for instance, loading equals true, load is true, and that's because we want this plugin to load every time that the editor loads, and then internal is false. This plugin that we're identifying here is not part of the CKEditor download that we downloaded earlier, so I need that to say false. So right now, this is the only thing that's in our MidCamp widgets module. But I identified when I did this that there's a new file that we need to create, plugin.js, and so that's right here in plugins, callout, and then plugin.js. So that's what this is. And this is where we get into using the CKEditor API. And so on the first line, it's CKEditor.plugin.add. And so this is the add method. And I'm naming it callout. And it has a few methods and properties here that I'll go through. So this new plugin, I guess I forgot to mention that when you create a widget, every widget is part of a CKEditor plugin, but not all CKEditor plugins are widgets. So CKEditor, most of the plugins in the CKEditor add-ons repository are not widgets yet, because it's a fairly new thing. So like the table plugin to add, everyone loves the tables in the WYSIWYG. The table plugin is not a widget. There's also like other filtering plugins, that sort of thing. But what we're going to focus on here is the basics of creating this plugin, and then the widget piece of the plugin. So this plugin itself requires the widget plugin, which we downloaded as part of CKEditor. It has one icon, which is the callout icon. There's an initialization method, which is run every time that the WYSIWYG loads. And so in this method, we're using another CKEditor API method, which is the widgets.add. And here we're actually creating our widget. And this is where it gets into the fun piece of what we're trying to do here today. We have to identify some button text for what, like when you hover over a button in the WYSIWYG, what it actually says in a tooltip. The next parameter is the template, and this is the actual widget template that we looked at in the source of the WYSIWYG, and so it's the two nested divs. So the div of class callout, and then the div of class with the class callout content, and then I'm also adding in just an extra paragraph in here that just says callout. So that'll get initialized every time, or that'll get added every time you do a new instance of a widget. The next, parameter for the widget add method is editables, and this is an object of all of the editable areas for your widget. And so, since this is a pretty simple example, we only have two divs here, an outer wrapper and like an inner content div. All we care about is editing what's inside that inner content area. And so I've called it content, and then this is where this selector here, this is what actually tells CKEditor, like, hey, this selector is actually anything inside of it you can edit. And so that's related to the callout content div above. And then additionally, in that editable object is an allowed content property. And so this gets back to the advanced content filter that I mentioned earlier. And so a little bit more about that. The advanced content filter in CKEditor 4, how many of you are familiar with Drupal's text format system? And so when you configure a text format, Drupal filters it on render, right? It filters it on render. So let's say you pasted something into your WYSIWYG, and then when you view the node, you're like, wait, why isn't the blink tag showing on my site, right? Well, that's because you haven't allowed it maybe into your text format. And so, Drupal by default cares about the actual render, but it actually stores like if you go back in and edit, it'll store like the blink tag there when you go edit the node. So that's kind of, that can be kind of confusing. And so on the front end, when you're editing content, this is where the new advanced content filter comes into play. You can actually, if you configure the ACF, the advanced content filter, every time that the editor loads on edit, it will strip out anything that is not defined. And so if you tightly configure your advanced content filter directly to what you're doing on the, render side with Drupal's text formats, you can have a much closer what you see is what you get editor experience. And it's actually quite cool. Some people get really frustrated with the ACF if you're just starting out with it. But I'd recommend taking some time and playing around with it, because it can be really helpful. And so if you've got your advanced content filter configured, properties like the allowed content here, let you just allow these options. So here I'm saying, only allow paragraphs, the BR tag, any lists, as well as strong and the emphasis tag. And then I'm also down farther here, right here, I've got another allowed content property here. And so this is the allowed content up here, the allowed content piece just for the editable area. So the one down below, right here, is actually for the widget itself. And so we need to make sure that the two divs that we created, that outer callout div and the callout content div, always come through the advanced content filter. And so that's what this property is doing. It's saying allow divs that have, the div has to have callout to come through. Otherwise, the whole div will be stripped out. And then this is actually something, these alignment classes, we're going to get to that later. But if there are alignment classes, if there's an align left, an align right, an align center, yeah, let that through too. And then the width property too. I'm saying if someone specifies, I want to have this callout be 300 pixels, well, let's make sure that the 300 pixels gets through too. And then you also need I don't think it's required. Oh, it is required. The required content property. And so this is if the advanced content filter is configured in a way that says, no divs are allowed in the WYSIWYG. But this plugin obviously needs divs. What this is saying here would be disable the callout plugin, disable that button from the WYSIWYG. And so what we're saying here is, yeah, I need to make sure that a div is allowed and a div with the class of callout. Because if that's not allowed, my button will be disabled and no one can add a widget. And then the final method here, right at the bottom, is called upcast. And this is actually what determines if something gets the yellow border around the WYSIWYG or the little draggy. And so if you don't have this, you'll be able to put your widget in, and then if you save it and then edit the node again, you won't get the nice outline and the draggy, so it won't think it's a widget. And so this function returns, if the function returns true, then it knows it's a widget. So in this case, we're saying return if the element name is div, and the div has class callout, hey, it's a widget in this instance. So these lines of code right here, that's all that's required to create the basics of our widget. Yes?
In your content template, you have the callout inside the paragraph tag. What is that?
Yeah, so right here.
Yeah.
So I'm just creating some like default content for the widget. And so when I add a new widget, it's going to have that paragraph with just callout in it.
Oh, okay. So
Yep.
that's not a variable.
Nope, that's not a variable. That's just some example text. And so we'll see that in a little bit that I'll actually be able to edit that since that's part of the editable region.
What would happen if you didn't have the template? You would still be able to edit a widget if it already existed, but you wouldn't be able to create one with the button? Is that the...
So you're saying if this widget template didn't, or this widget didn't have a template,
Yeah.
I don't think it would do anything. You would probably, you'd be able to add a widget, but it wouldn't. You'd add nothing into the WYSIWYG.
Okay.
So the template is pretty important here. Yep. Anything else?
One template, you can't have multiple templates for a single widget.
Well, so if you look at some of the code of some of the more advanced widgets on CKEditor.com, so like if you look at the enhanced image widget, for instance, it's called image 2. It actually, if you say, oh, I want a caption, it actually renders everything inside of a figure and then provides fig caption for that image. And so, but if you don't have a caption, it's just rendering the image. And so that's a really good example of like a very complex template. And so in that example, they don't just like, hey, the template is this HTML markup. It's a lot more advanced as far as like figuring out what kind of template I actually need. So you could specify like a function there, and then it could return the HTML that you need.
A JavaScript function?
Yep. Great. So for this plugin file and everything we've looked at here are all of the CKEditor documentation links for it. So the add method for adding a new plugin, the actual plugin definition when we're creating that plugin, and then the widget adding method as well as the widget definition. So, and CKEditor is fairly well documented. So in our plugin.js file, we identified this icons property here, and it's called callout. Well, that's associated with a button icon here. And so you need to make sure that inside of your plugin, which is called callout, we have an icons folder, and it's called callout.png to represent the callout property that we defined earlier. And this actually isn't very well documented. What size you need for that little icon. This is a little trial and error for me, but default it's 16 by 16 pixels, and then you can specify like a high DPI like option, and then you put a high DPI folder in there, and you can do like a 32 by 32 pixel image.
And it has to be a PNG?
I think so, yeah. So based on this code that I just wrote here, the plugin.js file, I've got another site set up to show you what the widget looks like at this point. So here's another site with the same dummy content. Let's say that we want to do the similar thing that I did earlier. So to create my new widget, I place the cursor where I want it, click on the widget button here, and it creates my little callout. And I can edit it. Let's save it. And it returns as a widget. It's highlighted. Now, I can't click on the draggy and get my little dialog. I can't set a width. So right now it's kind of boring, right? Like if we look at it in the source, it has my source structure. It's got my 2 divs that I identified in the template. It's got my editable area. When I click in, it only allows certain elements. But that's about it. So the first thing I think we should do is create some default styling for the widget. Because right now it's just boring, right? So to do that, we're going to create a callout.css file in our module. We're going to load the callout.css file inside of the WYSIWYG. So when we're editing, it actually shows the style. And then we're also going to load that callout.css file on the front end. So when we're viewing the node, it actually shows up right. So right now, I'm just going to create the callout.css file and put it in the root of my module. And really, it's just targeted on the callout class, and I'm doing some padding and some margin and a little border. And then here's the second hook that we're going to be using in our module file, and it's going to be hook WYSIWYG editor settings alter. So every editor has a lot of, at least for the JavaScript editors, there's a lot of settings that you can pass into it to configure it. And one of the ones that we're going to use for CKEditor is what's called contents CSS. And so this is an array of different CSS files that you can pull into the WYSIWYG. And so a lot of people set up the WYSIWYG to include let's include my themes CSS into the WYSIWYG, right? So it looks more what you see is what you get on the editing like you have on the front end. Well, this is just a way to do it in code to say, I also want to throw in any arbitrary CSS files. And that's what I'm doing in this hook. I'm getting the location of my module, and I'm saying add, callout CSS to contents CSS. And then the third thing, again, I need to do is, right now I'm just loading callout.css in my info file, in the style sheets, array. So I need to edit my, yeah.
So are you saying that in that example, the .info call to the CSS is for the front end,
right?
And then the editor is controlled by the function,
right? So since the WYSIWYG, at least CKEditor, loads in an iframe, and for that HTML instance, you need to load it in there, and so that's what the hook's doing. Yep. So let me make these changes real quick. So I'm in the info file, I'm uncommenting the style sheet, and then I'm in my module file, and I'm adding that callout or that CSS file into contents CSS. And then I'm clearing cache. So already on the front end, I have you can't see it here, but there is a very fine border around it. I promise. And on edit, I also get the fine border around it. It's there, I swear. So that's the basics, I would say, of creating a little widget for your WYSIWYG. There's actually a few other cool things I'd like to show, oh, we made the widget, but how do I make the configurable dialog, for instance? That's what I'd like to show next. Are there any questions about what we've looked at so far? Yeah.
I just have one question from an deployment standpoint. Since widgets aren't part of the package, and I know you guys have the site now, make file builds. How do you pull it in now? Do you have a specific file you pull, or do you drop the widget in the same libraries for?
That's a good question. So, full disclosure, we haven't used these yet in our service.
Okay.
But I think our plan is we're gonna use these, and we're gonna have some basic default ones for our service that like everyone will just get, like this callout one, and we'll include that like that plugin itself probably like this is so generic that I don't think it probably warrants living by itself somewhere, and so we probably do something like this where we have a custom module that.
I mean, actually, CKEditor, like
Oh.
in the library, like
Yeah.
it's not bundled with the package, so like if
Right.
you have, like the deployment,
Gotcha.
you get CKEditor to pull that in.
Yeah.
Is it any extra magic, or just drop it in the same libraries?
Yeah, it's sort of magic. So, like CKEditor, if you go to CKEditor.com and you say, I want to configure this, and you know, it actually has something called CKEditor Builder. And when you download your configuration, you get like a build config.js file, and that you can always like upload back to CKEditor and get a new one. Well, at the same time, like you get a URL for that like configuration from CKEditor. So like in your make file, you could use that like URL itself and pull that. Now the downside with that is like it's always going to pull the latest stable version of CKEditor at the same time. So that's actually something we've been looking at. Like, what if we don't want to always have the latest? What if they just released a new version and we pull it? You know. So I'm not sure.
You're still dancing around.
We're still dancing around that. Yeah. Yep. Like right now, actually for our service, we have a repository for all of our libraries that we're managing independently. So it's not the best solution, but it mitigates that problem for us.
Thanks.
Yep. So, if there aren't any more questions, we'll look at creating a dialog. And so we're going to do two things with the dialog. We're going to allow us to set a width on the widget and then also set alignment via CSS class. And so it's going to look like this. Excuse me. So back in our plugin.js file, in our initialization method, in our widget add method, actually taking a step back, we're going to look at the last bit first. So inside of our plugin add method, we can register a new dialog here. And so that's what I'm doing. So it's CKEditor dialog add. I'm calling it callout, and then I'm passing in the path to my dialog file, which is going to be in a dialogs folder /callout.js. And then up here in the widget add method, I'm associating the dialog with the widget to the dialog that we just registered. It's kind of backwards in this example. Sorry. So, like I said, we need a callout, or inside of our callout plugin, we need a dialogs folder, and we've got our callout.js file. So for the callout.js file, so we're building the dialog, and inside of the dialog, it's kind of like, I don't want to say it's like form API, but think of building a dialog like you would, like, you know, you're building a form here. And so the dialog itself, you want to give it a title, give it a minimum width and height. There's this contents array, and so this array is actually an array of tabs inside of the dialog. So for this example, we're only going to have one tab, and it's just going to be an info tab, just a generic one. But if we looking at the widget or the leaflet example I showed earlier, there's actually multiple tabs in there. You would specify just multiple objects in here in that array. So our basic dialog tab has an ID of info, and it has this elements array. And so each element inside, or each object inside of the elements array is actually a field inside of the dialog. So our first one is our alignment one. It has a type of select, so we just want our select dropdown. And alignment is so common in CKEditor that they've got included common properties for that. So that's what I'm using. A not set, align left, align right, align center. And then for each field, we have a setup method. And so for the setup method, what that's doing is actually, it's looking to see if we have a default value. What can we use for a default value when we bring the dialog up? And then a commit method, which is, okay, when I save this dialog, what do I do with the data? And so it's using a set data method, and it's setting the align data for the widget. And we're doing something similar with the width. So since we're creating a dialog and we're going to be using some classes, I'm adding to my callout.css file a few options here, just some CSS for my align classes. So we actually already did this earlier, but I just wanted to point out again that since we're adding new classes into our widget, we want to make sure that the allowed content for the widget still allows the new alignment classes, so they don't get filtered out. So we've defined the dialog JavaScript file. Now back in our plugin.js file, we need to make sure that when we have new data from the dialog, that the plugin itself knows what to do with it. And so there's actually two methods that we need to provide here. There's an init method for the widget itself, and then a data method. So we'll look at the init one first. And basically, this is the anytime the widget gets initialized in the WYSIWYG. So it could be when you create a new one, or when you edit the node and the WYSIWYG loads again. This is going to fire just for this widget, and we're going to see if there's width set, and if width is set, set the width data into the widget data object, and we'll get to that in a bit. Otherwise, we're also going to look at, hey, does it have a class? Great. If it has a certain class, add that in as an alignment property. And then, so anytime the set data method is run, the widget data method of the widget gets run at that time. So anytime you're setting data into it, it'll loop through this. So it's going to first look to see if, hey, is a width set for my widget? Or it's going to see if the width is empty, and if it is, let's remove width from the, as a property of the widget. Otherwise, set it as the width. It's going to remove all of the classes from the widget, and then if it has an alignment property set for this widget's data object, it's going to add a new class to the widget. So I think this is actually the most confusing part of when I was looking at making these, because it feels like I'm defining a lot of the same things. But once I looked at it a little bit more, it kind of made more sense to me. So this is what our final plugin code looks like. Like I said, I really encourage you to just look at this later. But the new methods that we created are right here inside of the widget add method. There's the initialization and the data, as well as the new dialogues. So let's see if I can uncomment all my code and see if we can get that dialog to show up. So I'm going to clear cache, my browser cache, because CKEditor library does get cached pretty heavily, it seems like, at least in Chrome. So now that I've done that, hey, my dialog shows up, and it should work. So that's working. Now, the last thing I wanted to show is, I think, the coolest part about these, and that's actually widget-based styles. So let me show you. So who's familiar with the styles dropdown of the WYSIWYG? At least in the WYSIWYG module, when you go to the configuration for WYSIWYG, there's like a text area where you can specify like, oh, crazy style equals div.crazy. And that kind of that's globally available in the editor. But you can make contextual styles based on each widget on a per widget basis. So let me show you what that looks like. We're adding to our callout CSS file. I'm creating two different styles: a primary style, which does like a darker background, and then a fancy style, which does like a fancy sort of gradient border. So I've added that into my CSS file. The other thing I need to do is, so at least right now, WYSIWYG module doesn't let you like in that like styles area configuration, like set widget styles. And the reason that is because to create a widget style, you need to set 2 new properties for each style. And you have to say like it's type widget and then what widget it is. So let me show you the configuration that I'm talking about. So if you go to WYSIWYG profiles and then your profile, CSS, it's these CSS classes. And so right here at the bottom, there's a link to the style sets documentation for CKEditor. And this is what talks about like on the back end what you're defining in that text area it actually does. Well, since widgets are so advanced, I'm using this hook, like back to the hook WYSIWYG editor settings alter, and I'm passing in my 2 styles, my fancy style and my primary style, and I'm setting these in code instead of through the configuration because they didn't figure out a way to do it in the GUI. So for each style, you need to give it a name, and in this instance, it's called fancy, and that's what's going to show up in the dropdown. Like I said, you need to tell it what type of style it is, so it's a widget style, and then since it's a widget style, we need to say what widget it's for, and that's this line here. So it's for the callout one, and then we're defining like, okay, well, what attribute do I need to add to that widget then? And that's what I'm doing here. I'm giving it a class of fancy. And I'm doing the same for the primary one. So let's do that. So I need to go to my module file and uncomment that code, clear cache. So now if I go back to my test, I'm going to clear cache here too, just in case. So now I'm not clicked on the widget. If I look at the styles dropdown, I don't have any. I have my generic none style. But if I click on the widget, I now have my new object-based contextual styles. And so if I select fancy, it creates my fancy style, which you can't see on it because it's too light. I promise it's there. Come up here and see it. It's beautiful. So that's all I have for this presentation. A few resources. If you're interested to hear just about like the body field and some of the problems that people have with it, Jeff Eaton's talk from DrupalCon is really good. And then Les's talk from the Twin Cities, actually. That's where I got a lot of these ideas from. The link to that is there as well. And there's a there's a 2-part series on making widgets in the CKEditor documentation. So, you have any questions? Yeah.
I know you haven't implemented it fully, but how about best practices for implementation with multiple styles? So you would just have a call-out module.
Yeah.
Would you expect a module for every widget you wanted to put in, or one per site, or?
I think it kind of depends on like your site, like your client, I guess, and you know, without knowing the background for that. Like for us, we'll probably have like we have a service-wide WYSIWYG module that sets some configuration for all of our sites, and for us, we'll probably have like 4 or 5 different widget options
And each
that
of those-
defined in that one module.
Oh, in one module.
Yeah, and so for us that would make sense because we want to have those 5 or 6 available on all 150 sites or something. But then if there's like a per site basis, we probably like, the news site, for instance, they've talked about like, it'd be really great to have like tweetable quotes or something embedded in line. So like that's really only something they're probably interested in. We'd probably make a one-off module for that. Yep. Yes.
In the examples that you've created, the way it's written right now, can you add multiple instances of the widget or just?
Yes, you can. I didn't show that. But yeah, each instance is independently available and configurable.
And similarly, if you wanted to restrict it so users could only add one of those callouts, I guess you could do that in the JavaScript or?
Yeah, if you only wanted one per WYSIWYG area, I don't know how that would work actually. You probably would be able to, I just don't know right offhand. Yeah.
So I had a use case a while ago for creating a place where people could edit recipes, and one of the requirements was the list of ingredients needed to go at the top. So is there a way to enforce that so that people would A, have to put in an ingredients list, and B, they could only place it at the top of the body?
I think not through like through the widget idea here. I'm not sure. I'm sure you could do like a specific plugin that would like check that, but I think you might want to think about like maybe that doesn't belong in the body area. Maybe that's a separate field set or something. That's a separate field above the body area where it's like a field collection or something, or a multi-value field of just here are the ingredients. So I don't think there'd be a way to contextually say, if you're using this widget, it has to be at the top. It has to be before something else. Yeah. Yeah.
How does that work for responsiveness? Is there rules to it, or?
So I think the site itself, my demo site, is using responsive Bartik. So I have a little bit set for that. So like for my alignment classes, once it gets low enough, it strips out the alignment. It stops floating it. But yeah, I think you could just use media queries on those classes. The hardest part is just maybe the width. Overriding the width maybe on, on mobile or something, yeah. Yes?
So I had a question, because we're stuck on TinyMCP, so I'm exploring CKEditor. Real quick, with the widgets, can you specify if it's a in-body editor style sheet, so that way you don't have to define styles that get loaded on both the back and the front end, so you can offload, because we have a 7-theme system, and we're not going to want the admin editor part to be influence the theme. Can you separate that in the CKEditor widget declaration, or do you have to just make your admin theme not that admin CSS not?
So I'm not sure I follow.
So your CSS is affecting in the editor and the front end.
Right.
Is there a way to tell CKEditor to only load that CSS when you're editing, so that way you can offload the front end rendering in your specific areas?
Yeah. So that hook I did where it does contents CSS, that's really the only place I'm saying, hey, load it in the WYSIWYG.
Okay.
And then the other one where I'm just specifying the style sheets option in the info file, That is just because I don't want to put it into my theme.
Yeah.
But you could definitely just do in your themes, just have the widget styles. Yep. Good question. Yes.
I was wondering why go through the, what was it, can you bring up the editor real quick? Forgetting what the term is for it. The styles menu, putting
Yeah.
your stuff in there, as opposed to making another field and letting a user select a style there and putting that as a class.
Sure. You could do it, I think, either way. I think, so for our editors, actually, we've never allowed the global styles dropdown because it's kind of been polluted whenever we tried that.
I try to keep it away.
Yeah, so, but if you can contextually add things there, I think it becomes a lot more useful. And I think it kind of just depends on maybe your workflow and like what you think what do people expect on the site? You know, do they expect, like, will they know that they can, will you train them to always open that dialog and that sort of thing? But I think you could definitely add like a drop down there in the dialog. Anything else? All right, well, don't forget about the sprint tomorrow, back here at Student Center in the tower. So please give me feedback on the talk. Thank you. If you want to look at what the style actually looks like, it's right over here.